Okay, now we get to our gospel passage, which comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Each year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to festival custom. After they had completed its days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Thinking that he was in the caravan, they journeyed for a day and looked for him among their relatives and acquaintances. But not finding him, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he had said to them. He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. Okay, great, beautiful. So this is Luke. Luke begins his gospel. He's got a beginning to his gospel that is different from the other three gospels. His gospel, we've been kind of looking at this, is that it has this entire narrative that begins in the temple in Luke chapter 1 with Zechariah going into the temple, and it now ends in the temple with Joseph, Mary, and Jesus going into the temple for their obligations, but then, of course, Jesus remaining in the temple and saying, "Do you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" So we call that the whole thing. We call that the infancy narrative, which of course is going to include his adolescence, this 12-year-old Jesus kind of thing. So anyway, so like this is kind of a conclusion. So it's kind of a neat conclusion that it begins in the temple and it ends in the temple, and then from there, the next chapter is chapter 3, which is the beginning of the public ministry with John the Baptist and with Jesus going out to him to be baptized by him, and then the temptation in the desert and all that other stuff. So that, like, just this chunk of time that Luke gives us an insight into that the other Gospels don't give us. And I mentioned this in last week's videos, or Christmas's videos, where it says that Mary kept these things. It says this here, just repeating the line. His mother kept all these things in her heart, reflecting on them, turning them over, thinking about them, and how that's possibly a little insight that Luke gives us, that the source of this material is not divinely inspired in the sense of he didn't know it, but it's divinely inspired in the sense that it was given by Mary. And it's not that Mary is divine, it's just that God can use human ways to inspire us, especially to inspire the scriptures. So that's just like a neat thing. If Luke was, just imagine him like sitting at her feet or sitting with her, and she said like, "Okay, tell me about this," and then she says, "Oh, but I got to tell you about this thing that took place." What a fun thing to think about. Just like Luke sitting with Mary and like just Mary telling stories about the childhood of Jesus, and oh man, so beautiful, so beautiful. Okay, so let's go back. Each year, Jesus's parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. So this actually is an obligation of the law that 3 times each year, the book of Deuteronomy chapter 16 lists this out as 3 times each year, all Israelite males are required to come before the face of God in the temple. So Deuteronomy, there's no temple yet, but before the face of God in the place that he determines, to appear before the Lord in the place that he determines. That, of course, develops over time because they're in the desert, and so they have to go to the tabernacle that's in the desert, and then the tabernacle kind of moves around a little bit, and then eventually David kind of establishes something of a permanent spot, and then Solomon finally establishes a permanent spot in Jerusalem when he builds the temple. Of course, that temple is destroyed, but then they're allowed to rebuild it. The Ark of the temple is no longer there, but they're still going into the temple to present themselves before the Lord. And kind of this is like a cool aside, I guess. But as an aside, there was within the temple, within the sanctuary, of course, the Holy of Holies had the Ark of the Covenant, which was like the ultimate sign of God's presence. But even once that was taken away, there were still other ways of offering sacrifice in the sanctuary, into the holy place. So there's the Holy of Holies, which is the furthest part in, but then there was also the holy place, like the main place of offering sacrifice. And within that, there was a place called the altar, or the table of the bread of the presence. And the Jewish people understood that this bread of the presence was a real sign for them of God's presence. So this bread that was offered by the priests on the Sabbath after Sabbath, they would offer this bread. along with a drink offering, which was wine, and they would place it on these golden vessels, and this like a golden or in a flagon and on a golden altar, and they would call it the bread of the presence, or the bread of the face of God. And so on these days, there's some Jewish evidence that suggests that the priests would take the altar and they would bring it out to the people in like this bigger courtyard, and they would show it to them and say, "Behold God's love for you." And they would do that these 3 times each year, when all of the men were required to go to Jerusalem to appear before the Lord, to appear before the face of God. And then the priest would bring out this bread that was known to be the presence of God, or a sign to them of the presence of God, which is it's kind of a neat thing to think about, because where do we have bread in a place of worship that we hear a priest say, "Behold"? Well, in the Holy Eucharist, right before Holy Communion, what does the priest say? He says, "Behold the Lamb of God. Behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb." So that's a separate video for a separate time, but just a really neat connection there, that this would take place. And that was a real thing that the priest would offer as their Sabbath offering, was this bread, as with the drink offering, the wine. We as Catholics offer what begins as bread and wine and turns into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, and it turns into his real presence before us. It's really neat. Okay, so anyway, so the 3 times each year that the men, all the Israelite men, had to go to Jerusalem to be presented before the Lord were on the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, which are separate times, and I suppose that's also a separate video to explain what those are, and would require me to study a little bit more about them, because I'm not, I know about Passover, but the other ones I'm not as confident in being able to explain. So anyway, so that's that. So they would come, and they had to do this. And then, of course, when they came, then their families would oftentimes come with them. So Joseph is going, as is his obligation. And Jesus, who's approaching adulthood, actually, as a 12-year-old, in our culture, it doesn't really seem like a 12-year-old is approaching adulthood, but Jesus is approaching adulthood, so he would have, of course, accompanied Joseph. But then, too, it makes sense that Mary would go along with as well, like this whole family traveling together to the house of God, which, echoes back to our first reading, how the family is meant to be centered around worship, centered around the temple of the Lord, the courts of the Lord, and actually yearn for this. So some Jewish people, I'm sure, did not look forward to the 3 times annual pilgrimage to the Holy Land, because it was inconvenient, or it took time and resources and whatever. But you can imagine a person who like really loves this. It's just like, oh man, I can't wait for that. I can't wait for these. Are things that I look forward to, similar to how we look forward to Christmas every year, or similar how do we look forward to Easter or other religious holidays. Well, I look forward to this. You can imagine how some of the Jewish people, maybe hopefully many of them, looked forward to this pilgrimage, this 3-time annual pilgrimage to the holy city, Jerusalem, to appear before the Lord. So anyway, they went up according to festival custom. After they completed his days, so they had to be there for certain things, they returned, but the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know. So this is where we run into, like, even amidst, like, we could say the perfect family, there's still a level of messiness that takes place. That even though, of course, Jesus is God, and so he's not sinful. We teach that Mary is not sinful as Catholics. We teach that. And Joseph, the Bible tells us, is a righteous man. So even within what we could say is the perfect family, they still experience the messiness of a broken world, which is miscommunications and insecurity in a kind of way, in a non-sinful way, anxiety in a non-sinful way. To think about that. That's just kind of a fascinating thing, I suppose. That so that if you recognize you're experiencing those things in your life, it's like, well, I mean, even the Holy Family didn't escape experiencing some messiness. So that might be a little bit comforting for you. Maybe not. Who knows? Anyway, so they're thinking. So they traveled for a day, and then only later realized that he's not there. So they're traveling for a day, which means that they have to travel back another day just to get to the city, and then they spend another day besides looking for him and not sure where to find him. And of course, where do they find him? Well, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, in the midst of these people doing what? They were in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and they all who heard were astounded at his understanding and his answers. So there's kind of like there's a human development that needs to take place in Jesus, and that's why it says at the end that Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. So there's a very real aspect of him that is human and needs to develop and grow, to build character, to acquire experiential knowledge, those kinds of things. But at the same time, there's also this other dimension of Jesus that is fully united with his humanity. So I don't want to like separate like, well, there's his divine nature over here and his human nature over here. No, like because of what we call the hypostatic union, that just simply means that his divine nature and his human nature are now united. They're one and the same. At the same time, there does seem to be a human way that Jesus needs to grow, even while his divine way within him clearly reveals itself from time to time. We know this like from the Transfiguration. We know this from when he's able to walk on water, that his divine human union, it reveals at different times in different ways his divinity and his humanity. And so the humanity of him needs to develop and grow, while the divinity within him is there. It's stable within him, united with his humanity. Okay, so anyway, so they finally find him, and they see him, and they're astonished themselves, his parents are, and his mother asks this question, and then he just says this: "Why are you looking for me? Do you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And they don't understand, because they're not divine like he is, and so there's something missing within their own understanding. But Jesus has this question. One person I was reading suggested that perhaps Jesus did connect himself with Samuel, and so just as Samuel lived in the temple perpetually, perhaps Jesus also anticipated living in the temple perpetually. That's kind of a fascinating thing to think about. But nonetheless, what do we ultimately see? We see here, but they didn't understand. He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother kept all these things in her heart. So Jesus, even though like he's revealing like, well, I need to be in my Father's house, at the same time, he also understands that he's a member of this family. And it's not that his parents are taking him away. So in no way do we want to suggest that what Mary and Joseph are doing and they're questioning, in no way do we want to suggest that what they're doing is sinful. But instead, it's just like unfolding God's plan for Jesus in the midst of this family context. And so he comes to them and he's obedient to them. Obedience as a son is one of the marks that needs to be present in every family life. That the children need to be obedient to their parents because their parents are the people that God has placed over them with authority over them to form them in the Lord. And of course, we know that Mary and Joseph, just as all parents, needed to be forming Jesus in the Lord, and they did. And just like all parents need to be doing that. But the point remains that children of parents need to be obedient to them. In fact, this is one of the commandments, is to honor your father and your mother, which includes within it this expectation of obedience, of respectful obedience and reverence. In fact, one of the readings that the other set of readings provided was from Sirach, where the Lord just talks about revering your parents. And St. Paul would talk about this as well in the letter to the Colossians, about revering your parents. The son who reveres his father, who cares for him, who honors him, will be given a long life, will be given blessings and blessings and blessings. We're not reading those readings, but that's the biblical truth, is that respect and obedience is owed to our parents just as it is owed to God. And in response to that respect and obedience, God will pour out blessings upon those people that don't necessarily always make sense. So anyway, that's kind of a neat thing. So there we go. So our gospel passage, our first reading, both connected around this central thing, which is the house of God, the courts of the Lord, which are meant to be the first desire that we have, even within the context of family life. Now, we still have another reading, where St. John is going to talk to us about how we are now invited into this family as Christians, as followers of Jesus. We're invited into the Holy Family of Nazareth and this greater family, which is the family of the Holy Trinity. And we'll look forward to that. Okay, God bless you.